On a spring evening in 1917, a party was in full swing at one of the grandest mansions ever built in America. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble walls. Wealthy guests laughed and raised champagne glasses in rooms decorated like the palaces of French emperors. Outside, a violent thunderstorm rolled across Long Island Sound, sending flashes of lightning across the sky. But inside the mansion called Winfield Hall, the host noticed nothing. Frank Winfield Woolworth, one of the richest men in America, was entertaining his guests in the style he believed he deserved. He had built a retail empire on nickels and dimes. He had constructed the tallest building in the world. And now, at 64 years old, he lived in a marble palace that rivaled anything in Europe. Then the telephone rang. The call came from Manhattan, the Plaza Hotel. The news was devastating. His daughter Edna had been found lifeless in her suite. She was only 33 years old. Woolworth hung up the phone. Before he could speak, before he could process what he had just heard, a bolt of lightning struck the mansion with tremendous force. The impact shook the walls, and when servants rushed to inspect the damage, they found something that would haunt this house for over a century. Above the main entrance fireplace hung a marble family crest. Carved into it were the painted faces of Woolworth's 3 daughters. The lightning had cracked the crest in a single, impossible line. The crack ran directly through the face of Edna, leaving her 2 sisters untouched. Some called it coincidence. Others called it something far darker. But from that night forward, the marble halls of Winfield Hall would never feel quite the same. The sounds of laughter would be replaced by whispers. The golden light would cast longer shadows, and the ghost stories would begin. This is the story of the Woolworth family and their cursed mansion. A tale of extraordinary ambition, unimaginable wealth, and the terrible price that came with it all. The boy who dreamed of something more to understand the man who built Winfield Hall. We must travel back to a small potato farm in the frozen countryside of northern New York. It was there, on April 13, 1852, that Frank Winfield Woolworth was born into a world of poverty and endless labor. The Woolworth farm sat near the village of Rodman, about 11 miles south of Watertown. The land was harsh and unforgiving. Winters lasted for what seemed like forever. The family scratched out a meager existence growing potatoes and raising livestock, always one bad harvest away from disaster. Frank's father, John Hubble Woolworth, was a stern man who believed in hard work above all else. His mother, Fanny McBriar, came from Scots-Irish stock and carried herself with a quiet dignity despite their circumstances. She had dreams for her sons that extended beyond the muddy fields and frozen barn doors. Young Frank was different from the other farm boys. While they seemed content with the rhythms of rural life, he found himself drawn to something else entirely. He watched the traveling peddlers who occasionally passed through the countryside, their wagons filled with exotic goods from distant cities. He studied how they displayed their merchandise, how they talked to customers, how they made a simple transaction feel like an event. At age 4, Frank announced to his bewildered parents that he would become a peddler when he grew up. His father dismissed it as childish nonsense, but Fanny saw something in her son's eyes. A spark, a hunger for something more. The Woolworth boys, Frank and his younger brother Charles Sumner, would play a game they called store. Frank would arrange items on a makeshift counter and practice selling them to his brother. He would adjust the displays, change the prices, experiment with different approaches. It was a child's game, but it contained the seeds of a revolution in American retail. Near their farm stood an abandoned house that fascinated the brothers. It had once belonged to Joseph Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon, who had lived in exile in America during the 1820s. The boys would explore the empty rooms, imagining the grand parties that had once been held there, the powerful men who had walked those halls. For Frank, these visits planted something deep in his imagination, the connection between power and grandeur. The idea that a man could build himself a palace, a monument to his own achievements. It was a dream that would consume him for the rest of his life. At 16, Frank left school to work full-time on the family farm. He hated every moment of it, the back-breaking labor, the bitter cold, the sense of going nowhere. His weak constitution made the physical work even more difficult. He suffered from ailments that kept him bedridden for days at a time. But his mother refused to let his dreams die. She dipped into her small savings to pay for him to attend night school in Watertown, where he could learn bookkeeping and commerce. Each evening, After finishing his farm chores, Frank would ride the family pony into town for his lessons. He was an odd sight among the other students, most of whom worked in offices and shops. His clothes were rough, his hands were calloused from farm work, but his mind was sharp and his determination was fierce. He was learning the language of business, and he knew it would be his ticket to a different life. The humiliation that changed everything, one memory from Frank Woolworth's childhood, would stay with him forever. It happened when he and his brother Charles were young teenagers. They had saved their pennies for weeks, scraping together 50 cents to buy a birthday present for their mother. It was an enormous sum for farm boys. They traveled into Watertown, excited and proud. In the window of a department store, they spotted a beautiful silk headscarf. It was exactly what they wanted. They walked inside, the 50 cents clutched in their hands. What happened next would burn itself into Frank's memory for the rest of his life. When the brothers approached the counter and produced their payment, all in loose change, the shop clerks gathered around to laugh at them. They sneered at the poor farm boys with their dirty coins. They suggested that maybe next year, the brothers might save enough for a proper gift. Frank's face burned with shame. He grabbed his brother's arm and marched out of the store. They found a different shop where the staff treated them with respect and bought the scarf there instead. On the walk home, Frank made a vow to his brother. Someday, he said, there would be stores where 50 cents could buy 5 or even 10 items. Stores where every customer would be treated with dignity, whether they were spending a little or a lot. Stores where the poor would be welcomed just as warmly as the rich. It sounded like a fantasy. But Frank Woolworth meant every word. From stock boy to store owner, the path from farm boy to retail pioneer was neither quick nor easy. In 1873, Frank finally escaped the farm and found work as a stock boy at a dry goods store called Augsbury and Moore in Watertown. The owner was skeptical of the scruffy country boy who appeared at his door, but his partner William Moore saw something promising. Frank offered to work for free for 3 months, just to prove his worth. Moore agreed to a compromise. Free labor for 3 months, then a small salary if Frank proved himself useful. It was an unusual arrangement, but Frank had no choice. He threw himself into the work with everything he had. He swept floors, delivered packages, arranged window displays, and watched everything. He absorbed every lesson about how the business operated, from the way merchandise was purchased to how customers behaved. What became immediately clear was that Frank Woolworth was a terrible salesman. He was awkward with customers, uncomfortable with the back and forth of negotiation that defined retail at the time. Every item in the store had a different price, and clerks were expected to haggle with customers to close deals. Frank simply could not do it. But he had a different talent. He noticed how customers responded to the way products were displayed. He understood that the arrangement of merchandise could do the selling work that he himself could not. He began experimenting with window displays, creating arrangements that drew people into the store. He also observed something that would change retail forever. The store occasionally set up a special table with leftover or slightly damaged goods, all priced at 5 cents. These tables were always crowded. Customers loved the simplicity of knowing exactly what something cost. No negotiation, no uncertainty. Just pick it up and pay. Frank filed this observation away. It would become the foundation of his empire. In 1876, he married a young woman named Jenny Creighton. She was a waitress he had met in Watertown, and she would become his most important partner and supporter. Jenny believed in Frank when almost no one else did. She would stand by him through failure and success, through wealth beyond imagination, and through heartbreak that no amount of money could heal. The birth of the 5 and dime by 1879, Frank Woolworth was ready to strike out on his own. He had observed enough. He had learned enough. He had a vision that he believed would revolutionize retail. He borrowed $300 from his mentor William Moore and opened his first store in Utica, New York. It was called the Great 5-Cent Store, and it operated on a simple principle that seemed almost foolish at the time. Every single item in the store would cost exactly 5 cents. No haggling, no negotiation. The prices were fixed, displayed clearly, and available to everyone. The store opened on February 22, 1879. Within weeks, it had failed. Most men would have given up. Frank Woolworth did not. He analyzed what had gone wrong. The location was poor. The merchandise selection was limited. But the concept itself was sound. Customers had responded to the clarity of fixed pricing. They had loved being able to browse and choose without pressure from salespeople. Frank moved quickly. In April of 1879, just months after his first failure, he opened a new store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This time, he expanded the concept to include items priced at both 5 and 10 cents. The location was better. The merchandise was more varied. And on opening day, sales reached over $127. The 5 and dime store was born. The success in Lancaster proved that Frank's vision was not a fantasy. Customers flocked to the store. They loved knowing exactly what things cost. They loved being able to afford small luxuries that had previously seemed out of reach. They loved being treated with respect, regardless of how much they spent. Frank recruited his brother Charles to help manage the growing business. He brought in former colleagues from his days at Augsbury and more. He developed a network of partners and investors who shared his vision. Store by store, town by town, the Woolworth empire began to spread across America. The secret to Frank's success went beyond fixed pricing. He understood something fundamental about human psychology. People wanted to feel like they were getting a good deal. They wanted to discover treasures among ordinary goods. They wanted shopping to be an adventure, not a chore. His stores became known for their bright red storefronts, their orderly displays, and their welcoming atmosphere. The clerks were trained to be helpful but not pushy. The merchandise was arranged to encourage browsing and impulse purchases. Every detail was carefully considered. By 1889, just 10 years after the Lancaster opening, Woolworth had 12 thriving stores. By 1900, he had 59 stores with sales exceeding $5 million. By 1912, when he merged his company with several competitors, the F.W. Woolworth Company operated nearly 600 stores and was valued at $65 million. Frank Winfield Woolworth, the farm boy who had been laughed at for paying in loose change, had become one of the richest men in America. The Cathedral of Commerce success brought Frank Woolworth more than money. It brought him a burning desire for recognition, for respect, for monuments that would prove to the world that he had truly arrived. In 1910, he began planning the greatest statement of his success. He would build the tallest building in the world, and he would pay for it entirely in cash. The site he chose was in Lower Manhattan, on Broadway between Park Place and Barclay Street. The architect was Cass Gilbert, a man who understood Woolworth's vision of combining modern technology with medieval grandeur. Together, they designed a Gothic tower that would rise nearly 800 feet into the sky. The Woolworth building was completed in 1913. At the time, it was the tallest structure ever built by human hands. Its 60 stories soared above the Manhattan skyline like a cathedral reaching toward heaven. The exterior was covered in cream-colored terracotta with intricate Gothic details. Gargoyles and ornamental carvings decorated every surface. The building's opening was a national event. President Woodrow Wilson pressed a button in the White House that illuminated the entire structure with electric lights, a stunning display that could be seen for miles. 80,000 bulbs blazed against the night sky, transforming the tower into a beacon of American achievement. Reverend S. Parks Cadman, speaking at the opening ceremony, gave the building its enduring nickname. He called it the Cathedral of Commerce, a temple to the power of American enterprise. Frank Woolworth loved the name. He had always seen himself as a kind of merchant prince, a modern equivalent of the great traders of medieval Europe. The Gothic architecture of his building connected him to that heritage. The soaring height proclaimed his triumph over everyone who had ever doubted him. The building's lobby was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Byzantine mosaics covered the vaulted ceilings. Marble walls gleamed under golden light, and hidden among the decorative details were small sculptural portraits of the building's creators. One showed Frank Woolworth himself, counting his nickels and dimes. Another showed architect Cass Gilbert holding a model of the tower. Frank's personal office on the 24th floor was designed in the French imperial style, with walls lined in green marble and furniture that had once belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte. The farm boy from Rodman now sat at an emperor's desk, presiding over an empire built on 5-cent purchases. The Woolworth building would remain the tallest in the world until 1930. It still stands today, a monument to one man's extraordinary ambition. But Frank Woolworth was not finished building monuments. The dream of Winfield Hall. Even as the Woolworth building rose toward the sky, Frank was planning something even more personal. He wanted a home that would rival the great estates of European aristocracy, a palace where he could entertain royalty and display the treasures he had accumulated from around the world. In 1914, he purchased a property in Glen Cove on Long Island's Gold Coast. This stretch of the North Shore had become the playground of America's wealthiest families. The Morgans, the Vanderbilts, the Astors all had estates here. Frank Woolworth intended to outdo them all. The property he acquired was called the Humphreys Estate, and it came with an existing mansion, but Frank had no interest in living in someone else's house. He had already commissioned architect Charles Pierrepont Henry Gilbert to design something new, something unprecedented, something that would bear his name for eternity. Then, mysteriously, the existing mansion burned to the ground. The fire was never explained. Some whispered that it was convenient, almost too convenient, that Woolworth already had plans for a new building. Others dismissed such talk as gossip. Whatever the truth, the destruction cleared the way for Frank's vision to become reality. Construction began immediately. The new mansion would be called Winfield Hall, taking Frank's middle name just as the Woolworth building had taken his surname. But where the skyscraper was a public monument, Winfield Hall would be something more personal, a reflection of Frank Woolworth's innermost dreams, obsessions, and fears. The design drew inspiration from the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the intimate palace where Marie Antoinette had retreated from the formality of court life. But Frank wanted something far more elaborate. The entire structure would be built from imported marble and limestone. Fire had destroyed one house. This one would be fireproof. The costs were staggering. The final price tag reached $9 million, equivalent to nearly $200 million in today's money. The grand staircase alone cost $2 million. It was carved from pink and beige marble, sweeping upward through the center of the mansion like something from a fairy tale. The mansion contained 56 rooms spread across multiple floors. There were 12 bedrooms, each decorated in a different historical style. One room honored the Ming dynasty. Another captured the elegance of the Elizabethan era. A third recreated the opulence of Louis XIV France. But the most significant room was dedicated to Marie Antoinette. Decorated in delicate French style, it would become the most mysterious and tragic space in the entire mansion. The house was filled with secret passages, hidden chambers and tunnels that connected different parts of the estate. Some said these were practical features for servants to move unseen. Others believed they reflected something darker in Woolworth's personality, a desire for hidden knowledge, an obsession with secrets and the supernatural. The Napoleon obsession. As Frank Woolworth grew older and wealthier, his personality took increasingly strange turns. The most pronounced of his obsessions was his fascination with Napoleon Bonaparte. It had begun innocently enough. As a boy, Frank had played in the abandoned home of Napoleon's brother Joseph, imagining the grand life of emperors and conquerors. But as an adult with unlimited resources, the fascination became something more intense. Frank came to believe that he was somehow connected to Napoleon. Some accounts suggest he thought himself the reincarnation of the French emperor. He began collecting Napoleonic artifacts with an intensity that bordered on mania. He acquired furniture, artwork, and personal items that had belonged to Napoleon and his court. The entrance to Winfield Hall was designed as a marble replica of the Arc de Triomphe, the monument Napoleon had built in Paris to celebrate his military victories. Every visitor to the estate would pass through this arch, a reminder of the power and glory that Frank believed he shared with history's great conqueror. Inside the mansion, Frank's personal bedroom was decorated entirely in the Napoleonic style. His bed had reportedly belonged to Napoleon himself. Portraits of the emperor hung on the walls. A bust of Napoleon watched over the room. But eventually, Frank began replacing some of Napoleon's portraits with images of himself. The farm boy from Rodman had become, in his own mind, the equal of emperors. His interest in the occult deepened as well. The late 19th and early 20th centuries had seen a surge of interest in spiritualism, seances, and communication with the dead. Frank became fascinated with these practices. He explored ideas about time travel and the supernatural. Some visitors to Winfield Hall reported that he spoke of attempting to contact spirits from the past. The mansion itself seemed designed to facilitate these interests. A massive pipe organ filled the music room, its sound capable of shaking the entire house. Frank learned to play it late in life, filling the marble halls with eerie music that could be heard by neighbors across the estate. The ceiling of one room was designed to resemble a planetarium, creating an intentional atmosphere of mystery and otherworldly wonder. Combined with the organ music and the secret passages, Winfield Hall became less like a home and more like the stage for some grand and unsettling drama. The tragedy of Edna Frank Woolworth and his wife Jenny had 3 daughters. Helena, the eldest, married well and lived a relatively stable life. Jessie, the youngest, followed a similar path. But Edna, the middle daughter, seemed destined for tragedy from the beginning. Edna was born in 1883, just as her father's empire was beginning to expand. She grew up surrounded by increasing wealth and all the privileges it brought. But privilege did not bring happiness. In 1904, Edna married Franklin Laws Hutton, a handsome financier who was the brother of Edward F. Hutton, founder of the famous brokerage firm. The wedding was a grand society affair. 2 wealthy families united. A golden future seemed assured, but the marriage was troubled from the start. Franklin was a notorious philanderer. He showed little interest in fidelity or in his wife's emotional needs. Edna, trapped in a loveless union, fell into depression and despair. In 1912, Edna gave birth to a daughter named Barbara. The child would grow up to become one of the most famous and tragic heiresses in American history, known to the world as the poor little rich girl. But in those early years, Barbara was simply another complication in an already difficult life. Edna's marriage continued to deteriorate. Franklin's affairs became more blatant. His absences grew longer. Edna, isolated and heartbroken, turned to her father for help. But Frank Woolworth, for all his wealth and power, could not fix his daughter's broken heart. The details of what happened on May 2, 1917, remain somewhat unclear even today. What is certain is that Edna was found lifeless in her suite at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. She was 33 years old. The official cause of death was listed as suffocation due to mastoiditis, a severe ear infection. But rumors immediately began to circulate that the true cause was something else entirely. Many believed that Edna, unable to bear her unhappy life any longer, had chosen to end her own suffering. The family moved quickly to suppress any investigation. City officials, some have suggested, were paid to avoid asking difficult questions. An autopsy was never performed. The truth of what happened that night died with Edna. But the tragedy was not yet complete. The night of the lightning, when the call came to Winfield Hall informing Frank Woolworth of his daughter's passing, he was in the middle of hosting a grand party. The guests had no idea that anything was wrong. The music played on. The champagne continued to flow. Outside, a violent thunderstorm was building over Long Island Sound. The wind howled through the ancient trees that lined the estate's driveway. Lightning flashed across the sky with increasing intensity. And then came the bolt that would create a legend. It struck the mansion with tremendous force, shaking the walls and sending servants scrambling to check for damage. When they gathered in the main hall, they found something that seemed impossible. Above the fireplace hung a large marble family crest. Carved into it were the painted faces of Frank Woolworth's 3 daughters. The lightning had cracked the marble in a single, precise line. The crack ran directly through the face of Edna, leaving Helena and Jessie completely untouched. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Marble cracks. Lightning causes damage. There was nothing supernatural about it. But others saw something more significant. A sign. A message from beyond. A warning that something dark had entered Winfield Hall and would never leave. From that night forward, the stories began. Servants reported hearing sounds in empty hallways. The organ would play by itself in the middle of the night, even though no one was touching the keys. Visitors claimed to see a woman in a faded blue dress walking through the gardens, only to vanish when approached. The most persistent reports centered on the Marie Antoinette room. People heard crying coming from behind its locked door. Whispers, soft sounds of weeping that seemed to come from no living source. Some believed it was Edna's spirit, trapped in the house where she had spent so much time, unable to move on from her tragic end. Others suggested that she had not passed on at the plaza at all, that her final moments had actually occurred in this very room. Despite what the official records claimed, the Marie Antoinette room was locked. It would remain locked for decades. No one wanted to face what might be waiting inside. The final days of Frank Woolworth. The loss of Edna broke something in Frank Woolworth that could never be repaired. He had built an empire. He had constructed monuments that would outlast him by centuries. But he could not save his own daughter. His wife Jenny offered little comfort. She had been suffering from what doctors called the living death, a condition we would now recognize as early-onset dementia. She had retreated into a world of her own, unable to recognize her husband or understand the tragedy that had befallen their family. Frank threw himself into his work with desperate intensity. He planned elaborate celebrations for the 40th anniversary of his first successful store. He continued to expand the company, opening new locations across America and around the world. He consulted with President Woodrow Wilson on matters of national importance. But his health was failing. He suffered from violent mood swings. He spent days at a time bedridden with ailments that doctors could not explain, and he neglected one simple thing that would ultimately cost him everything. Frank Woolworth was terrified of dentists. It was an irrational fear, but an overwhelming one. He refused to seek treatment for dental problems that grew increasingly serious. An infection developed. He ignored it. The infection spread. By early April of 1919, Frank was visibly ill. He continued working, refusing to acknowledge the severity of his condition. On April 4th, he left his desk at the Woolworth building for the last time. 4 days later, on April 8, 1919, Frank Winfield Woolworth passed away from septic shock caused by his untreated dental infection. He was 66 years old, just 5 days short of his 67th birthday. The man who had built an empire on nickels and dimes, who had constructed the tallest building in the world, who had created a marble palace to rival European royalty, died because he was afraid of going to the dentist. At the time of his passing, his fortune was estimated at $76 million. His company operated more than 1,000 stores across multiple countries. His name was known throughout the world, but all that wealth could not buy him happiness. It could not save his daughter. It could not heal his wife. And it could not quiet the whispers that had already begun in the halls of Winfield Hall. The haunted house after Frank Woolworth's passing, Winfield Hall entered a long period of uncertainty and decline. Jenny Woolworth, still lost in her dementia, inherited everything. She never understood that the fortune had come to her. She never understood that her husband was gone. Jenny passed away in 1924, and the estate changed hands. In 1929, the wife of Richard S. Reynolds purchased the property. The Reynolds family, founders of the company that would create Reynolds Wrap aluminum foil, maintained the mansion for several decades. But the strange occurrences continued. Servants reported seeing apparitions in the hallways. The organ continued to play itself in the dead of night. The Marie Antoinette room remained locked, its secrets hidden behind a door that no one dared open. In 1963, the mansion was purchased by Grace Downs, who transformed it into a business school for young women. The Grace Downs Academy taught modeling, charm, and secretarial skills. As many as 30 girls at a time lived and studied in the marble halls. The students gave the mansion a new nickname. They called it Glamour Manor. But glamour could not dispel the darkness that seemed to permeate the building. The young women began reporting strange experiences. They heard whispers in empty rooms. They saw shadows that moved when nothing else did. They felt cold spots in places where no draft should exist. The Marie Antoinette room became the focus of the most disturbing reports. Despite remaining locked, students claimed to hear crying coming from within. A woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, weeping for something that could never be recovered. Several students who stayed in rooms near the Marie Antoinette chamber reported prophetic warnings. They would wake in the night to find a woman standing by their bed, telling them that something terrible was about to happen. In at least 2 cases, students who received these warnings later met tragic ends in circumstances unrelated to the mansion. The atmosphere at Winfield Hall grew increasingly oppressive. Students began holding seances in the secret passages and hidden rooms, attempting to make contact with whatever spirits lingered in the marble walls. Whether they succeeded or simply frightened themselves, the results were the same. More reports of supernatural activity. More unexplained phenomena. More fear. In 1975, the Grace Downs Academy closed its doors. The school had become too associated with tragedy and the supernatural to continue operating. The remaining Woolworth artifacts and Napoleonic treasures were sold at auction, and Winfield Hall stood empty once again. Monica Randall's discovery in 1978. A writer and photographer named Monica Randall moved into Winfield Hall. She had heard the stories about the mansion's haunted reputation, and she wanted to experience it for herself. What she discovered over the following years would form the basis of her book, Winfield, Living in the Shadow of the Woolworths. Randall's account of life in the mansion is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. She describes hearing voices that seemed to come from another time, conversations between people who had been gone for decades. She reports seeing apparitions that appeared and vanished without explanation. She documents the strange behavior of the pipe organ, which would produce music even though its mechanisms had long since ceased to function. But the most remarkable aspect of Randall's time at Winfield Hall was her growing conviction that Frank Woolworth himself still lingered in the building. She found evidence of his Napoleonic obsession throughout the mansion. Hidden rooms that had been designed to replicate ancient Egyptian chambers. Secret passages that seemed to have no practical purpose. And most intriguingly, she became convinced that somewhere in the mansion's depths lay a replica of the king's chamber from the Great Pyramids. Randall believed that Woolworth had purchased an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus and had built a hidden chamber to house it. She speculated that his body might not be in the family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, but instead remained at Winfield Hall, entombed in his own private pyramid. The theory has never been confirmed or disproved. The mansion's many secret spaces have never been fully explored. Whatever lies hidden in the walls of Winfield Hall remains hidden still. Fire, decay, and rebirth. After Monica Randall's departure, Winfield Hall continued its journey through different owners and purposes. Martin T. Carey, brother of former New York Governor Hugh Carey, purchased the property in 1976. He was a preservationist who recognized the historical importance of the mansion and worked to restore it. From the 1980s until 1995, the property was leased to the Paul Corporation, which used it as corporate headquarters. The marble swimming pool and tennis courts were demolished to make way for parking lots. The practical needs of modern business took precedence over historical preservation. Later, the mansion was used as a training center for seeing eye dogs. Then it sat empty again, slowly deteriorating as the years passed. On January 28, 2015, fire once again visited Winfield Hall. Flames erupted on the first floor and spread rapidly upward, reaching the attic before firefighters from 8 different towns could bring them under control. More than 100 firefighters battled the blaze, trying to save what remained of Frank Woolworth's dream. The damage was extensive. Much of the interior was destroyed. The marble walls survived, but the wooden floors and ceilings, the intricate moldings, the carefully designed rooms were all consumed. And just as with the fire that had destroyed the original house on the property more than a century earlier, no one ever determined what caused the flames. Some called it coincidence, others saw a pattern. Fire had cleared the way for Winfield Hall to be built. Now fire had nearly destroyed it. As if something wanted to erase the mansion from existence. As if something did not want its secrets to survive. Despite the damage, Winfield Hall was not demolished. Restoration efforts continued. The mansion still stands today, one of the last great marble houses remaining on Long Island's Gold Coast. The legacy of nickels and dimes, the story of Frank Woolworth and Winfield Hall raises questions that have no easy answers. How does a man rise from such humble beginnings to build such an extraordinary empire? What drives someone to construct monuments of such overwhelming grandeur? And why did all that success bring so little happiness? Frank Woolworth changed the face of American retail. His innovations in fixed pricing, self-service displays, and mass merchandising laid the groundwork for every discount store and big-box retailer that followed. Walmart, Target, Costco all traced their business models back to principles that Woolworth pioneered. The Woolworth building still stands in Lower Manhattan, no longer the tallest but still magnificent. It has been converted to luxury residences, its Gothic spires now housing the wealthy rather than the workers who once filled its offices. The five and dime stores themselves eventually faded away. The last American Woolworths closed in 1997, but the company lives on in transformed form. Foot Locker, the athletic shoe retailer, traces its corporate ancestry directly back to Frank Woolworth's empire of nickels and dimes. And Winfield Hall endures, damaged but still standing, haunted by memories if not by ghosts. A monument to one man's extraordinary ambition and the price he paid for achieving it. The poor little rich girl, the tragedy of the Woolworth family, did not end with Frank and Edna. It continued into the next generation, most famously in the person of Barbara Hutton. Barbara was just 4 years old when she found her mother's lifeless body. The trauma of that discovery would shape her entire life. She grew up isolated and lonely, raised by governesses and distant relatives rather than by loving parents. Her father showed little interest in her. Her grandfather Frank, who had called her princess and showered her with attention, passed away when she was still a small child. What Barbara did have was money. An almost incomprehensible amount of money. By the time she turned 21, her inheritance from the Woolworth fortune had grown to more than $40 million. In the depths of the Great Depression, she was one of the wealthiest young women in the world. The press called her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that captured the essential tragedy of her existence. She had everything money could buy, and nothing it could not. She married 7 times, including a union with movie star Cary Grant, but never found lasting love. She was exploited by fortune hunters, abandoned by those she trusted, and unable to form genuine human connections. Barbara spent her fortune with abandon, giving generously to friends and strangers alike. She donated her London home to the American government to serve as the ambassador's residence. She supported charities and individuals without counting the cost. By the end of her life, almost nothing remained. The woman who had been worth hundreds of millions died in a Los Angeles hotel room in 1979 with reportedly less than $4,000 to her name. She was 66 years old, the same age as her grandfather when he passed away. Barbara Hutton is buried in the Woolworth family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery, reunited in death with the family whose fortune had shaped her life and whose tragedy had echoed through her own existence. The mansion today, Winfield Hall, survived the 2015 fire and has been partially restored. In 2022, it sold for $8.25 million to a buyer whose identity has not been publicly disclosed. The mansion has appeared in numerous films and television productions over the years. The HBO miniseries Mildred Pierce, starring Kate Winslet, was filmed there. Taylor Swift's music video for her song Blank Space used a similar Gold Coast mansion as its setting, though not Winfield Hall itself. Professional wrestling promotions have filmed commercials on the grounds. Adult films have been shot within its walls. The marble halls that once hosted society's elite now serve as backdrops for modern entertainment. The ghost stories continue. People who visit the property report feeling watched. They hear sounds that have no source. They see movements in their peripheral vision that vanish when they turn to look directly. The Marie Antoinette room remains a focus of supernatural speculation. Some say it has been opened in recent years. Others claim it remains sealed, its secrets locked away as they have been for more than a century. Whether ghosts truly walk the halls of Winfield Hall, whether Edna Woolworth's spirit still weeps in the room named for a doomed French queen, whether Frank Woolworth himself lingers in his marble palace, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that Winfield Hall endures as a monument to a particular vision of success. It stands as a reminder that wealth beyond imagining cannot guarantee happiness. That ambition pursued without limit can lead to isolation rather than fulfillment. That the grandest palaces can become prisons for those who build them. A dream carved in stone looking at Winfield Hall today, standing silent among its ancient trees with the waters of Long Island Sound visible in the distance. One cannot help but wonder what Frank Woolworth would think of how his story turned out. He built an empire that transformed American retail. He constructed monuments that continue to define city skylines. He created jobs for hundreds of thousands of workers across multiple continents. His innovations made consumer goods accessible to ordinary people who had previously been excluded from the marketplace. But he also created a dynasty marked by tragedy. His daughter's life ended in despair. His granddaughter's existence became a cautionary tale about the burdens of inherited wealth. His own final years were shadowed by grief, illness, and the growing eccentricity of his obsessions. The marble halls of Winfield Hall echo with all of these stories. The triumphs and the tragedies, the incredible achievements and the devastating losses, the dreams that came true and the nightmares that followed. Frank Woolworth wanted to build something that would last forever. In that, at least, he succeeded. His buildings still stand. His innovations still shape how we shop, and his mansion still watches over Long Island Sound, keeping its secrets behind walls of stone. The boy who was laughed at for paying in loose change built a palace that emperors would envy. But in the end, all his nickels and dimes could not buy him peace. And now, more than a century after his passing, the shadows of Winfield Hall still remember what his wealth could never purchase. Some dreams, it seems, carry costs that cannot be counted in any currency, and some houses, once built, never let go of the spirits who created them. Winfield Hall stands today as it has for over a century, waiting, watching, remembering. And for those who listen carefully on quiet nights when the wind blows in from the sound, they say you can still hear the organ playing. Music from another time, from another world, from a man who wanted everything and discovered, too late, that everything was not enough. The architecture of obsession. To truly understand Winfield Hall, one must look beyond the ghost stories and examine the building itself. Every architectural choice reflected Frank Woolworth's inner world, his desires and fears made manifest in marble and gold. The mansion was designed in the Italian Renaissance style, its facade covered entirely in imported marble. The symmetrical design featured a 5-bay central mass flanked by 4-bay wings, creating an impression of perfect balance and harmony. But behind that orderly exterior lay something far more complex. The interior was a maze of period rooms, each recreating a different era of history. Walking through Winfield Hall was like traveling through time itself. One moment you stood in Ming Dynasty China, surrounded by lacquered furniture and silk screens. The next you found yourself in Elizabethan England, with dark wood paneling and portraits of nobles gazing down from the walls. This approach to decoration was not unusual for the Gilded Age. Wealthy Americans often filled their homes with historical artifacts and period reproductions. But Woolworth took the concept further than most. He did not merely collect objects from the past. He tried to inhabit the past itself. The 16 fireplaces scattered throughout the mansion each told their own story. Some were carved with classical motifs. Others featured medieval imagery. One was surrounded by Egyptian hieroglyphics, a nod to Woolworth's fascination with the ancient world. The gardens were equally elaborate. 70 full-time gardeners maintained the grounds, creating formal landscapes that rivaled the great estates of Europe. Statues lined the long driveway approaching the house. Fountains sparkled in carefully manicured clearings. The Neptune fountain featured life-sized figures that seemed ready to spring to life at any moment. Inside, the attention to detail was obsessive. The chandeliers were crafted from blue glass and 15-karat gold leaf. The woodwork featured mahogany imported from tropical forests. Sterling silver accents caught the light and threw it back in dazzling patterns. But perhaps the most remarkable feature was what visitors could not see. The network of secret passages that honeycombed the house. Hidden doorways concealed behind bookcases. Tunnels connecting distant parts of the estate. Rooms that appeared on no blueprint, accessible only to those who knew their secrets. Why did Woolworth build such an elaborate system of hidden spaces? The practical explanation was that servants needed to move through the house unseen. The wealthy did not want to encounter the staff who made their comfortable lives possible. But the extent of Winfield Hall's secret architecture went far beyond practical necessity. Some have suggested that Woolworth was preparing for some sort of emergency. Others believe he simply enjoyed the idea of hidden knowledge, of knowing things that others did not. His interest in the occult and spiritualism may have played a role. Perhaps he intended to use these secret spaces for seances or other supernatural experiments. Whatever his reasons, the hidden architecture of Winfield Hall has never been fully mapped. Monica Randall, who lived in the house for years, believed that significant portions of the building remained unexplored. Secret rooms that no one had entered in decades. Passages that led to destinations unknown. The house keeps its secrets still. The workers who built the dream behind every great mansion stand the countless workers whose labor made it possible. Winfield Hall was no exception. Hundreds of craftsmen spent years transforming Woolworth's vision into reality. The marble was quarried in Italy and shipped across the Atlantic in massive blocks. Skilled masons shaped each piece by hand, fitting them together with precision that modern builders still admire. The work was dangerous and exhausting, performed in all weather conditions with tools that seem primitive by today's standards. Inside, Teams of specialists created the intricate decorations that defined each room. Woodcarvers worked for months on single pieces of furniture. Metalworkers shaped bronze and silver into elaborate fixtures. Painters and gilders applied layer after layer of finish to achieve the desired effect. Most of these workers remain anonymous. Their names do not appear in the historical record. They built a palace for a man whose name would be remembered for generations, while they themselves were forgotten. The irony would not have been lost on Woolworth, who had started his career as an anonymous worker himself. He knew what it meant to labor in obscurity, to create value that others would claim. But by the time he built Winfield Hall, he had traveled too far from those origins to truly remember them. The mansion required a permanent staff of dozens just to maintain it. Cooks, maids, gardeners, groundskeepers all worked to keep the estate running smoothly. They lived in quarters on the property, their lives organized around the needs of the Woolworth family. For some of these workers, employment at Winfield Hall was a source of pride. They had helped create something magnificent. For others, it was simply a job, a way to earn money in an economy that offered limited options. Their stories, too, have largely been lost to time. What remains is the building itself, a testament to what human hands can create when directed by unlimited wealth and boundless ambition. The end of an era. The story of Winfield Hall is also the story of a particular moment in American history. The Gilded Age, as it came to be known, was a time of extraordinary wealth concentration and equally extraordinary inequality. Men like Woolworth accumulated fortunes that seemed almost supernatural in scale, while workers labored for wages that barely covered survival. The great mansions of Long Island's Gold Coast were monuments to this inequality. They proclaimed, in marble and gold, that some people were simply better than others, that wealth conferred not just comfort, but a kind of moral superiority. World War I began to shake this certainty. The Great Depression shattered it entirely. The mansions that had seemed so permanent suddenly looked like relics of a vanished world. Many were demolished. Others were converted to schools, museums, or corporate offices. The lifestyle they represented became impossible to maintain. Winfield Hall survived this transition, though barely. Its various owners struggled to find purposes for a building designed to serve one family's grandiose vision. Each new use stripped away more of its original character. Each passing year added to its decay. Yet something keeps drawing people back. The ghost stories, certainly. The celebrity association with Taylor Swift and other modern entertainers. But also something harder to define. A sense that Winfield Hall represents something important about the American experience. The dream of rising from nothing to everything. The belief that hard work and intelligence can overcome any obstacle. The discovery that achieving the dream does not always bring the happiness we expect. Frank Woolworth embodied all of these elements. His story continues to resonate because it touches something fundamental in the American psyche. We want to believe that success is possible for anyone. We also suspect, in our darker moments, that such success might come with hidden costs. Winfield Hall stands as evidence of both possibilities, a monument to achievement that became a monument to loss, a palace built on nickels and dimes that could not purchase peace, a dream carved in marble that outlasted the dreamer but could not escape his shadow. The house waits still on its hill above Long Island Sound for whatever the future might bring. Its walls hold memories that span more than a century. Its secrets remain sealed behind locked doors and hidden passages. And its ghosts, real or imagined, continue to walk the halls where Frank Woolworth once dreamed of immortality. Some stories have no endings. They simply continue, transforming with each new generation that discovers them. The story of the Woolworth family and their haunted mansion is one such tale. It began with a boy on a frozen farm who dared to dream of something more. It continues today in the marble halls of Winfield Hall. And somewhere in those halls, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of an organ playing, music from a time that never quite ended, from a dream that refused to fade, from a man who built his heaven on earth and discovered that even paradise can become a prison. That is the legacy of Frank Winfield Woolworth and his five-and-dime empire. That is the dark story of Winfield Hall.